He went undercover in his own hotel, and froze when he heard 3 simple words from a black cleaning lady who had just been humiliated in front of everyone. At 45, Richard Coleman thought he had seen it all. Owner of the most luxurious hotel chain on the East Coast, he had built an empire through relentless work, sacrifice, and determination. But on that cold Tuesday morning, disguised as a maintenance technician, Richard was about to witness something that would shake the very foundations of everything he believed in. The Grand Metropolitan Hotel's lobby glittered with marble and gold. Guests moved like royalty, staff like shadows. And then, in front of everyone, the unimaginable happened. Manager James Morrison stood before a trembling 52-year-old woman named Grace Johnson, his voice loud and sharp. "People like you always find a way to take what isn't yours," he barked. A guest had accused Grace of stealing a diamond bracelet. Without a shred of proof, Morrison ordered security to search her in front of tourists, employees, even children. Phones were recording. Whispered gossip filled the air. Grace stood still, her eyes glistening but proud. She didn't plead, didn't fight back, she simply endured. When the guards found nothing, the truth emerged: the bracelet was still in the guest's safe. No apology. No remorse. Morrison simply shrugged. For him, publicly humiliating a loyal employee was just another day at work. As Grace quietly gathered her cleaning supplies, she looked up and whispered 3 words to the man in overalls standing nearby. "You remind me." And in that instant, Richard Coleman froze. Because in those tear-filled eyes, he saw himself, a memory buried deep within. He had once been that poor black boy cleaning floors no one noticed. The boy who'd been told to know his place. Grace wasn't just any employee. She came from the same neighborhood, the same struggle, the same forgotten streets. And now, watching her humiliation, Richard felt shame, not for her, but for himself, for what his empire had become. That night, from a modest apartment he had rented to keep his disguise, Richard called his old friend Michael Torres, a civil rights lawyer. "Michael," he said quietly, "I think my company has a rot in its core. I need your help." For 3 days, Richard worked undercover, collecting evidence. What he found was horrifying. Morrison's cruelty wasn't an isolated case, it was systematic. Unfair schedules, blocked promotions, degrading comments, a pattern of racial bias across departments. Grace had been the silent backbone of the hotel, respected by the staff, feared by those who thrived on oppression. She had trained others, solved conflicts, even prevented lawsuits. Yet Morrison saw her as a threat, someone too proud for her own good. When Richard overheard Morrison planning to fire Grace using fabricated performance failures, his heart broke. He realized this was more than one woman's story, it was a reflection of thousands like her, across his empire. Richard couldn't stay silent anymore. That night, he planted discreet recording devices in Morrison's office, copied his emails, and gathered witness testimonies. Every insult, every biased policy, every abusive conversation, all captured. Meanwhile, Morrison grew bolder, confident that no one dared challenge him. But justice was watching. Then came Friday night. At a party for investors, Morrison, already half-drunk, made a series of racist remarks about Grace. "Some people," he said loudly, "just don't have the intellect for higher jobs. It's genetics, really." The crowd went silent. But the hotel's audio system, secretly connected to Richard's recorder, caught every word. That was all Richard needed. He sent the files to Michael. "This isn't just discrimination," Michael said. "It's career suicide. When do we strike?" "Monday morning," Richard replied. "In front of everyone." Monday. The lobby was filled again. Morrison, full of fake confidence, had organized a live demonstration of hotel cleaning standards, with Grace as the target. Cameras were rolling. Guests were watching. It was meant to be her public humiliation. But today, the humiliation would belong to someone else. As Morrison began, Richard stepped forward, no longer in disguise. He was dressed sharply, radiating authority. Gasps spread through the crowd. "Mr. Coleman." Morrison stuttered, his face draining of color. "You're right on time," Richard said calmly. "I've been waiting for this demonstration." At that moment, Attorney Michael Torres entered the lobby with 2 bailiffs and a briefcase full of evidence. Richard turned to Morrison. "You've spent weeks creating a system of racial humiliation in my hotel," he said, his voice echoing through the marble hall. "Every second of it, recorded." Michael opened the briefcase. Systematic discrimination. Harassment. Defamation. It's all here. Then Richard pressed play. Morrison's own voice filled the lobby. "It's genetics, really. Some people just don't belong in quality establishments." The crowd erupted in murmurs. Phones recorded everything. Guests, employees, even reporters captured the moment. Morrison tried to speak, but his voice trembled. That was taken out of context. "No," Richard said firmly. "It's the context you created." Morrison's termination letter was handed to him on the spot. Grace stood in silence as the man who'd humiliated her was escorted out. She turned to Richard with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "For seeing me. For listening." Richard smiled softly. "Grace, you reminded me who I was, before I became what I am." Months passed. Grace Johnson wasn't just reinstated, she was promoted. Richard made her the Director of Human Resources and Organizational Culture for the entire hotel network. Together, they built something extraordinary, the Second Chances program, offering education, jobs, and scholarships for marginalized communities. At the program's grand launch, Grace stood on stage, her voice steady and proud. "When I started cleaning rooms 15 years ago, I never imagined I'd stand here today. Mr. Coleman didn't just fire one man, he transformed an entire company." Applause filled the hall. Since then, Hoffman Hotels had seen record employee satisfaction, higher profits, and national recognition for diversity. What began as one woman's humiliation became a movement of empowerment. As for James Morrison, his career ended the day that recording went viral. The same arrogance that once made him powerful had now made him infamous. He spent his days working behind a small motel desk, a fallen king of prejudice. Richard, meanwhile, found peace not in wealth, but in purpose. He created foundations for underprivileged youth and funded scholarships for black students in hospitality. Grace became the face of the company's transformation, a living example that dignity and courage can change systems. A year later, when Hoffman Hotels won the National Award for Diversity and Inclusion, Grace and Richard stood side by side on stage. "This award," Grace said, "belongs to every employee who had the courage to speak against injustice, and to every leader brave enough to listen." Richard added, "True leadership isn't about control, it's about using power to lift others." Outside the glittering event hall, the city lights sparkled, reflections of a better world being built, one act of courage at a time. Sometimes, justice doesn't arrive in courtrooms or through grand speeches. Sometimes, it begins with 3 simple words whispered through tears. "You remind me." Because those words can awaken something far greater than revenge. They can awaken humanity. Weeks after the scandal, the Grand Metropolitan wasn't the same place. The golden hallways, once filled with silent fear, now echoed with laughter and relief. For the first time, employees spoke freely, and Grace's new office door was always open. Richard began holding weekly staff meetings, something unheard of before. "No hierarchy," he said. "Just honesty." He wanted to hear their voices, the housekeepers, the bellboys, the receptionists, the very people who kept the hotel running. At first, they hesitated. Years of being ignored had taught them silence was safer. But slowly, stories began to emerge, tales of unfair treatment, stolen credit, dreams buried under other people's arrogance. Grace listened to every word. Richard did too. And every time someone spoke, Richard remembered that day in the lobby, the day a woman's dignity was almost destroyed, and his humanity nearly lost forever. A few months later, Richard invited Grace to lunch at the rooftop restaurant, the one she used to clean every morning before sunrise. She smiled nervously as she stepped into the room. "I used to wipe these tables," she said softly. "Now I'm eating at one." Richard chuckled. Funny how life works when we stop pretending we're better than others. Grace looked at him for a moment and asked, "Why did you go undercover in the first place?" He leaned back, the wind brushing against his face. "Because I stopped trusting the reports people gave me. The smiles, the numbers, they hid what was really happening. I wanted to see the truth for myself. And I found it, in you." Grace smiled, but tears glistened in her eyes. "You didn't find me," she said gently. "You remembered yourself." Those words stayed with Richard for days. As the months passed, Grace's influence spread beyond the hotel. She began mentoring young employees, especially women of color who had been passed over for promotions. She told them, "Don't let anyone make you believe kindness is weakness. Sometimes the strongest people are the quiet ones." Soon, national news outlets caught wind of the transformation happening inside the Grand Metropolitan. Headlines read, "Undercover Millionaire exposes racism, rebuilds empire with humility." From maid to manager, the woman who changed a billionaire's heart. When a journalist asked Richard what made him do it, he replied, "Because leadership without empathy isn't leadership at all. It's dictatorship in a suit." That quote went viral, viewed millions of times, shared across social media, sparking conversations about privilege, accountability, and redemption. But for Richard, it wasn't about fame. It was about redemption, not the kind that makes headlines, but the kind that heals souls. One evening, about a year later, Grace received an unexpected letter. It was from Morrison. The letter was shaky, handwritten, and humble. "Grace. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I've lost everything, my career, my friends, my reputation. But the truth is, I gained something I never had before, perspective. Watching that video of myself broke me. You didn't humiliate me, my actions did. I'm truly sorry. James." Grace sat in silence for a long moment. Then she folded the letter, whispered a small prayer, and placed it in her desk drawer, not out of anger, but as a reminder that change sometimes begins in the wreckage of one's mistakes. When she told Richard about it, he nodded slowly. "People can fall," he said, "but what matters is whether they choose to rise differently." A year later, the Grand Metropolitan hosted a charity gala to celebrate the success of the Second Chances program. Hundreds of people filled the ballroom, former employees, students, single mothers, and refugees, all whose lives had been transformed through the initiative. Grace stood on stage, now confident and radiant. She looked around at the faces once weary, now full of pride, and said, "This program isn't about giving pity. It's about giving opportunity. Because talent doesn't have a color, and dignity doesn't have a price tag." The audience rose in applause. Then Richard stepped up to the microphone. He paused for a long moment, scanning the crowd. "You know," he began softly, "when I went undercover, I thought I was looking for flaws in my staff. But what I found were flaws in myself. I was building towers when I should have been building people." His voice trembled slightly. "I used to think success was about the size of your business. Now I know, it's about the size of your heart." The audience erupted again. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled. But for Richard, the noise faded away. He looked at Grace, and for the first time in years, he felt at peace. Later that night, after everyone left, Richard stood by the window overlooking the city. Grace joined him quietly. "You did something incredible," she said. He smiled faintly. "No, we did. You gave me something money can't buy, clarity. She looked at him curiously. And what's that worth to a millionaire? He chuckled. Everything. As the lights of the city shimmered below, Grace turned to leave. But before she walked away, she whispered something, the same 3 words that had changed everything months ago. You remind me. This time, Richard understood. It wasn't just a memory. It was a message, a reminder that humility and humanity must walk together. Because when power forgets compassion, empires crumble. But when compassion leads power, empires heal. And so, the story of a millionaire and a maid became more than a viral tale, it became a mirror for anyone who ever forgot where they came from. Because sometimes, the richest people aren't the ones with the biggest bank accounts. They're the ones who never stop listening, even when the truth hurts. Moral of the story. Never let success silence your empathy. Because one act of injustice can destroy a legacy. But one act of compassion can rebuild a world.